We're now going to talk about the Crusades, a series of holy wars that pitted the East against the West. Here are the terms. As always, make sure you get them down and listen for them as we move forward. During the Middle Ages, most people in Western Europe were just totally unaware of the advanced civilizations living in Asia, Africa, and the Americas. The Crusades are going to change all of that. The Crusades are going to introduce Europeans to a wider world. They also led to increased trade and more powerful monarchs. By 1050, when Western Europe was barely emerging from isolation, several civilizations in the Middle East and Asia had been major powers for many, many centuries. During Europe's Middle Ages, Islam had given rise to a brilliant new civilization. Islamic civilization reached from Spain across North Africa and the Middle East and on to the borders of India. Muslim traders and scholars spread goods and ideas even farther afield. Trading caravans regularly crossed the Sahara Desert to West Africa. Arab ships touched at ports on the East African coast and sailed on to India, Southeast Asia, China, and Korea. Through contacts with diverse cultures, Muslims acquired and passed on a whole range of ideas and technologies. The biggest challenge, though, facing Christendom was the invasion of the Muslims. This would lead to the Crusades, a series of holy wars encouraged and commanded by the Pope to free the Holy Land from the Muslims. Prior to this, there had been a holy war in Spain to free it of Muslims, but this had taken centuries to accomplish. The motives behind the First Crusade were complex, and they have to be understood within the context of its time, especially in the Byzantine East. Now, the Byzantine Empire had reached its peak around the year 1000. Now, in the years following that, they've got some problems. In the 1050s, a group of people known as the Seljuk Turks invaded the Byzantine Empire. Now, these people had migrated from Central Asia into the Middle East and into what's today Turkey, which was part of the Byzantine Empire, where they converted to Islam. And by 1071, the Seljuks had overrun most Byzantine lands in Asia Minor, present-day Turkey. The Seljuks also extended their power over Palestine and attacked Christian pilgrims to the Holy Land. Latin Christendom had been concerned for the Holy Land for quite some time. Western pilgrims had been going there for penance or grace for quite some time. Merchants and prostitutes also went along to make money off the pilgrims. And so travel in and through the area was pretty common by the 11th century. And it was mainly people like pilgrims from the Byzantine Empire, which is Christian, going this way. Although you would have some from Western Europe. They'd go by land and pass through Constantinople and into Asia Minor, which was controlled by the Arabs and then later the Turks. And for a long time, this hadn't caused any problems because the Muslims understood the pilgrimage. They were fine with it. But now the Seljuk Turks have taken over, and reports start filtering back to the Byzantine emperor that the Seljuk Turks are harassing the pilgrims. What bothered the Western Christians now was that the Holy Land was in the hands of the infidel, people they considered to be unbelievers. Now, the Holy Land was the site of three major religions. It's the site of Jesus' life, death, his crucifixion and resurrection. It's the site of Jewish history and worship. For example, in Jerusalem, you have the Wailing Wall, which is what's left of the temple. And now it becomes home to and important to the Muslims. As the Seljuk threat grew, the Byzantine Emperor Alexius I sent an urgent plea to Pope Urban II in Rome. So in 1095, Emperor Alexius I asked for Christian knights to come to his empire to help him fight the Turks. Although the Roman popes and the Byzantine emperors had been rivals for quite some time, the Pope agrees. Now, Pope Urban shrewdly associated helping Byzantium with freeing the Holy Land from the Muslims, and so he planted the seeds for the Crusades. And on November 27th of 1095, he called the Council of Clermont. And so all these French and German bishops and nobles and some Englishmen come to listen, and he incites them to action. He says, "From Jerusalem and the city of Constantinople comes a grievous report. An accursed race has violently invaded the lands of those Christians and has depopulated them by pillage and fire." And then he goes on to call for a crusade to free the Holy Land. He says, "Seize that land from the Seljuks and subject it to yourselves. Undertake this journey eagerly for the forgiveness of your sins and with the assurance of everlasting glory in the kingdom of heaven." He goes on to say, "Jerusalem is now held captive by the enemies of Christ, those who do not know God, the heathen. Jerusalem wants to be free and begs you to come help. Who will take up this work? Who will right these wrongs? Who will recover this territory if you weren't?" And then the assembly roared, "God wills it," in response to the Pope's words. And this phrase, "God wills it," becomes the battle cry of the Crusades. Some of the main ideas of Urban's speech were that going on the Crusades promised the warriors a heavenly reward. So basically, if they die in battle, they're going straight to heaven. Their sins are forgiven. He aroused indignity at the alleged atrocities being committed on Western Christians. He really exaggerated what was going on. He flattered the diversity of the nobles, making them feel as if only they could accomplish this crusade. He promised that there would be plenty of opportunity for wealth and power. He also suggested that the Crusades would serve to diffuse the energies of the knights. Basically, they're always fighting. Let's send them elsewhere and let them fight somebody else. Give them a common enemy. Now, one of his big motives was that he wanted to enhance the office of the papacy to make it the supreme religious institution in the world and to bridge the gap between Eastern and Western Christianity. He wanted to be the supreme leader of the church, and for that he needed the Eastern bishop's support as well as that of the emperor. So if you think about the dates, this is 1095. What happened in 1054, several decades earlier? That's the date the church split into the Eastern Orthodox and the Roman Catholic Church. And now, 41 years later, Pope Urban wants to bridge that gap and reunify the church. So he sees an opportunity to use the Crusades to do that. Well, his speech inspired Europe to put together a great army of crusading knights. But it takes time. They all had to go home, get their affairs in order, get their equipment and everything they needed ready, and it took time. It's not something that could happen overnight. Because it took a while for the Christian nobility to mobilize, somebody else got involved. He was tired of waiting, and this is a man named Peter the Hermit. So in early 1096, he puts together this motley throng of peasants and landless knights, and he starts his own crusade. It's called the People's Crusade because it was inspired by ordinary people. It was not ordered by the church or supported by the church. And so under Peter the Hermit, these guys set out for the Holy Land. Now, these crusaders basically pillaged their way through the Balkans to Constantinople. They are presented to the emperor, and he's kind of shocked at the state of this crusading army because when he asked for Christian knights to come help, this isn't quite what he expected, but he does agree to provide transportation for them. So the People's Crusade ends up heading over to the Holy Land, where they're met by the Turks, who promptly slaughter them. And that's the end of the People's Crusade. But it also shows the devotion of the people of Europe, that they were willing to do this and that they truly thought that they were doing God's work and that they would be protected. Here you see the land we're talking about. So up at the top in purple, you see the Byzantine Empire. And then over on the right, on the eastern shore of the Mediterranean, the orangish area, you see the Holy Land, as well as some of the area below, the green. It's what's today Jerusalem and Israel, part of Palestine. At that time, Syria was also considered, part of Syria was also considered to be part of the Holy Land. Well, a few months later, in the summer of 1096, the real Crusaders arrived in Constantinople. And here you see on this map the route taken by the first Crusaders. And, it might look like a jumble, but that's because you have crusading knights coming from all over Europe. Some sailed directly to the Holy Land, others went via Constantinople. But those who do present themselves to the emperor meet with him, and he is pleased, much more pleased with this crusading army than he was with the first, although he was a bit depressed, I guess you could say, down that there were no kings along, but he did agree to assist the crusading knights by giving them transportation and the supplies they needed. In return, though, they had to agree to return any provinces taken from him by the Muslims. So any land that the Seljuk Turks had taken from the Byzantine Empire, these knights are promising to return if they're able to reclaim it. And so they took a pledge to do this. And if you remember, I mentioned in a previous lecture that during this time, these oaths, these promises that people made, they really meant something. You would never even consider breaking an oath in this world. So that's an important thing to remember here. So what ends up happening is that these crusaders thought that since taking the Holy Land was God's will, it would be something easy to accomplish, but it wasn't. It took 3 years until June of 1099 for Jerusalem to fall to the Crusaders. And when that happened, when the crusading knights had Jerusalem in their control, to celebrate, they rampaged through the city and slaughtered the Jews and the Muslims. And that's how they celebrated their victory. So end result, yes, they're controlling the Holy Land, but now the Muslims really hate the Crusaders and the West. And I want to mention here, as you can see on this slide, it wasn't just those who were fighting who went over to the east during the Crusades. You've got the knights who want to go and fight. You've got various types of soldiers, archers, etc. You've also got cooks, women, priests, and various other types of people traveling. And this is important because we're going to see large groups of people being exposed to the culture and the people of the East. And many of them are going to bring elements of that culture back to the West. Well, what ends up happening is that the Crusaders, at the end of the First Crusade, they've taken control of the Holy Land. Now, if you recall, they took an oath to the Byzantine emperor where they promised to return that land to him. They don't. They keep it. And they've got to figure out, okay, we took this land. How can we maintain this land so far from home? Now, some of the knights did just go home, but a few thousand stayed to defend Jerusalem. And using feudal principles, the remaining knights organized the territory into four crusader kingdoms, the most important of which was Jerusalem. They built European-style castles there in the middle of the desert, some of which are still there. I once, years ago, I was in Israel, and I was in a city called Accra, and this was before I knew the history of the place regarding the Crusades. And I remember going through a castle, and I was told that Richard the Lionheart built this castle. And it was really interesting because it was like being in England. You know, if you didn't know you were in Israel and if you didn't really look at the surroundings, you would think you were in the English countryside because this castle was so English. And that's what they did throughout these Crusader kingdoms. And so they maintained them and they ruled them just as they would back in Europe. What's the problem with this? Well, their actions in Jerusalem widened the gap between Muslims and Christians, and now they've broken their oath to the Byzantine emperor. They've kept this territory even though they had taken an oath, a pledge to return it. And so now the Byzantine emperor is not happy with them, and the gap between East and West widens. Interestingly enough, some of the best soldiers on the scene were monastics, clergy members, who were also soldiers. And a couple of monastic orders of knights formed during the Crusades, one of which was the Knights Templar. Now, after Christian armies captured Jerusalem in 1099, the Muslims are no longer controlling it. Groups of pilgrims from across Western Europe started going there to visit the Holy Land. But they're having to cross Muslim territory or Muslim-controlled territory as they do so. And so a lot of them were robbed, they were killed, they were assaulted. So the result is that around 1118, a French knight created this military order along with some other knights, and they called it the Poor Fellow Soldiers of Christ and the Temple of Solomon, but they came to be known as the Knights Templar. And they had the support of the ruler of Jerusalem, and they set up their headquarters there in Jerusalem, and they actually set up their headquarters on the Temple Mount, which is a sacred place, and they pledged to protect Christian visitors to Jerusalem. Now, the original purpose of the Knights Templar was to protect pilgrims from danger, but over the years, as the years passed, slowly but surely they expanded their duties, and they end up becoming defenders of the Crusader states in the Holy Land, and they were known as brave, highly skilled warriors, some pretty fierce fighters, and they were driven by religious fervor. And in fact, if you were a Knight Templar and you were in battle, you were forbidden from retreating unless you were just significantly outnumbered. The Templars built castles throughout the Crusader states, and they fought and won quite a few battles against the Muslim armies. And their fearless style of fighting became a model for other military orders. The Knights Templar were also known for the various missions they went on. For example, trying to find the Holy Grail. They could be identified by the Red Cross on their uniform. And they ended up setting up recruiting houses throughout Europe. And for several hundred years, they were very prominent and powerful as protectors of the Holy Land. They also became very wealthy. Whereas the Knights Templar were mainly from England and France, we have the Teutonic Knights from the Germanic lands or the Holy Roman Empire. And they were formed in the city of Accra, which is in present-day Israel in the Holy Land, in 1190. And they were loyal to the Pope and to the Holy Roman Emperor. And their purpose was to help Christians on their pilgrimages to the Holy Land and also to establish hospitals throughout the Holy Land. So very similar to the Knights Templar. And they also, like the Knights Templar, were great military warriors. They were there to help defend this land that had been reconquered as well. Now, interestingly, they actually still exist. They were disbanded in 1938 by Adolf Hitler, but after World War II, 1945, they came together once again, but they're largely ceremonial today. They're not out there on the battlefield as they once were, but they're largely ceremonial, and they also set up hospitals and do charitable work throughout, mainly like Germany and Austria, etc. Their motto, the motto of the order was help, defend, heal. And here you see an image of a Teutonic Knight. You see the white garment with the black cross, and this was sometimes used as their coat of arms. And interestingly, this image of the black cross was later used for insignia and military decoration by Prussia, which was a kingdom that became the nucleus of Germany in the late 1800s, and by Germany itself as the Iron Cross. And here you see the shield and cross of a Teutonic Knight. The Second Crusade was called by a conservative monk named Bernard of Clairvaux. What ends up happening is that, the crusading knights of the First Crusade were successful in reclaiming the Holy Land, but then from that point forward, they're going to be struggling to hold on to it. And bit by bit, the Muslims are going to gobble up pieces of it, which is what launches new crusades. And so the Christians had actually been defeated in several areas in the Holy Land, and some of the land had fallen back into the hands of the Seljuk Turks, and the kingdom of Jerusalem and the other Crusader states were threatened with the same thing. And so bishops from that area had appealed to the Pope and to the King of France, and basically they're like, please send help, help us to hold on to this territory. And so Bernard was commissioned to preach the Second Crusade. And so at first, he's going around and preaching and trying to raise an army, and nobody really cared. There was hardly any popular enthusiasm for this crusade, not like there had been in 1095. So Bernard decided that it would be helpful to focus on the idea that if they go on this crusade, they will gain absolution for their sin and go right to heaven. And on March 31st of 1146, he ends up preaching to a pretty large crowd. The King of France was present, and he gives this very enthusiastic, passionate speech. And I'm going to read a section of a document that talks about this to you. It says, a large platform was erected on a hill outside the city. King and monk stood together, representing the combined will of earth and heaven. The enthusiasm of the Assembly of Clermont in 1095, when Peter the Hermit and Urban II launched the People's Crusade and the First Crusade, was matched by the holy fervor inspired by Bernard as he cried, "O ye who listen to me, hasten to appease the anger of heaven, but no longer implore its goodness by vain complaints." And then he goes on to say, "Clothe yourselves in sackcloth, but also cover yourselves with your impenetrable bucklers. The din of arms, the danger, the labors, the fatigues of war are the penances that God now imposes upon you. Hasten then to expiate your sins by victories over the infidels, and let the deliverance of the holy places be the reward of your repentance." As in the olden scene, the cry, "God wills it, God wills it," rolled over the fields, and was echoed by the voice of the orator, "Cursed be he who does not stain his sword with blood." So he gives this passionate speech, and then everybody in the crowd is so enthused they rush up to join. And it's supposedly they ran out of cloth to make crosses, and Bernard is even said to have given his own outer garments up to be cut up to make more crosses. So he leads the Second Crusade, but ultimately it's not going to be much of a success. It turns out to be pretty much of a flop. One reason for this is that the Muslims were enhanced by one of their greatest leaders, a man named Saladin. And under Saladin's leadership, they were able to retake a lot of the land that the first Crusaders had claimed. They retook Syria, Mesopotamia, and Jerusalem. So the Christians had only been able to hold on to Jerusalem for roughly 90 years, from 1099 to 1187. So the response? Call another crusade and try to figure out what went wrong with the Second Crusade. This is going to be the Third Crusade, and the solution was to take along kings. So the Third Crusade was headed by three kings: the King of England, the King of France, and the Holy Roman Emperor. You've got Richard the Lionheart, the King of England, participating, Frederick Barbarossa, the Holy Roman Emperor, otherwise known as Redbeard, and Philip Augustus, the King of France. So the hope was that the presence of these kings would turn things around and the Third Crusade would be a success. Unfortunately, the presence of kings didn't really help that much. And it didn't help that Barbarossa, the Holy Roman Emperor, drowned not long after arriving in the Holy Land. Evidently, he wanted to take a bath and ended up being pulled down under the water because of his armor and swept away. And Richard had a few military successes, but mostly the Third Crusade was a big failure. One important result of this crusade, though, was the permanent break between East and West, as Constantinople's Christians allied with the Muslims against the Western Christians. However, Richard did discover something. He actually met Saladin and discovered that this guy wasn't so bad, and the two leaders actually formed an alliance of sorts. And in fact, at one point, Richard became very ill. And you can imagine how miserable it must be to be in the desert with a fever. And Saladin heard this, and so he sent his personal physician with a refreshing gift of peaches and snow. And in the end, Richard and Saladin ended up negotiating, and an alliance was formed. Under this alliance, The Turks, the Muslims, would not bother the Christian pilgrims. They could come and go to Jerusalem as much as they pleased for 10 years. So there'd be basically a 10-year truce where the Christians had full access to Jerusalem. It still is going to be held by the Muslims, but they're not going to bother the Christians. And so for 10 years, we're going to have peace. The last major crusade was the Fourth Crusade. And this is probably the most infamous of all of the Crusades. So if you look at this map, you notice I say this is the proposed route of the crusading knights. They had intended to travel from their various places in Europe to Venice. And we see during the Crusades some northern Italian cities rising to power economically because they're supplying these crusading armies with the supplies like ships that they need. So these crusading knights go to Venice, and the Venetian merchants make a deal with them. They tell these knights, they're like, okay, you do something for us, we'll help you out. If you do something for us, we will give you all the supplies you need, and we won't charge you. So what do they want the knights to do? Well, they want them to intimidate their trading rival. There's a town called Zara, which you can see on this map, just south of Venice, major trading rivals of the Venetians. So the knights are like, okay, we'll do it. And so they were going to go to Zara, intimidate them, and then head on to the Holy Land. That's the proposed route. Here's the actual route. They leave Venice and go to Zara, where they don't just intimidate these people, they end up killing them and burning the city to the ground. Now, Zara was a Christian city, and when word filters back to Europe and the Pope as to what had happened, the Pope demanded that these knights return to Europe immediately. They refused. He excommunicated them. They didn't care. And they basically rampage and pillage their way to Constantinople. You can see on this map how they put in at various coastal locations. And with each stop, each time they stop, they pillage, they loot, it just kind of fires up this bloodlust inside of them until they finally reach Constantinople. They're so fired up that they get to Constantinople and they sack the city. For the first time in its history, the city is sacked. They spend days rampaging through the city, destroying priceless manuscripts, looting, stealing, destroying. And this is going to be incredibly traumatic for the people of Constantinople. Psychologically, they're never really going to recover from this. This also marks the end of the Fourth Crusade. And those crusaders who sacked the city never even left to or bothered to leave to fight for the Holy Land. They liked Constantinople and the surrounding area, and so they ended up staying there. The most tragic of all of the Crusades was the Children's Crusade. You know, the first several Crusades have not been very successful. And so people are trying to figure out what's wrong here. Why can't we win? And they decided that sinfulness had kept them from victory, especially after the Fourth Crusade. And so they decided that, okay, you know, who's without sin? Who can do this? And then they hit on the idea of children. Maybe only innocent souls, children, could redeem the Holy Land. So the call went out for a children's crusade. All over Europe, this crusade is being preached, and amazingly, people from all over Europe sent their children. I mean, can you imagine sending your child or, you know, a younger sibling off to fight in a foreign land? You know, why would they do it? Well, it shows the faith of these people. They truly believed that this was God's will that they were doing, and these children were made promises. They had been promised that the Mediterranean Sea would part for them. They saw visions of Jerusalem in their hands. And so children come from all over Europe, and they are loaded onto ships which are supposed to carry them over to the Holy Land. Unfortunately, these ships were being run by unscrupulous shippers who, instead of bringing them to the Holy Land, transported them to Egypt where they were enslaved. And that is the end of the Children's Crusade. Pope Innocent III was the pope who called the Fourth and Fifth Crusades. And as we saw, the Fourth Crusade was a total bust. In 1219, he called the Fifth Crusade, which was a dismal failure because of fighting between veteran crusaders and new crusaders. And then there's going to be 4 more major crusades after this. Each was led by a monarch with good intentions, but each one failed. The Seventh and Eighth Crusades were led by King Louis IX of France, who was kidnapped and later killed. The Ninth Crusade was the last crusade, and it was led by Edward I of England. Muslim armies had overrun the Crusader states, and by 1291 they captured the last Christian outpost, and that included, or that was the port city of Acre. So this final foothold in the Holy Land fell. And as in Jerusalem 200 years earlier, the victors massacred the defeated enemies. But this time the victims were Christian. So, why did so many people take up the cross, as they said? Why did so many people go on this journey? Well, religious reasons played a large role. But there were also a lot of knights who hoped to win wealth and land. Some crusaders were trying to escape troubles at home. Others just wanted adventure. The Pope also had mixed motives. Urban hoped to increase his power in Europe and maybe heal the split between the Roman and the Byzantine churches. He also saw the lands of the Middle East as an outlet for Europe's growing population. And finally, he hoped that the Crusades would set Christian knights to fighting Muslims instead of each other. And so, for 200 years, Crusaders marched and fought, and for a time occupied parts of Palestine. Only the First Crusade, though, ever came close to achieving its goals. The Crusades failed in their chief goal, the conquest of the Holy Land. They also left a bitter legacy of religious hatred behind them. And that's a legacy and a division that will continue up until the present day. In the Middle East, both Christians and Muslims committed appalling atrocities in the name of religion. In Europe, Crusaders sometimes turned their religious fury against Jews, massacring entire communities. But the Crusades did have some positive effects. And the Crusades began just as Europe was emerging from the Middle Ages, and so they helped to quicken the pace of changes that were already underway. So I want to take a moment and look at several areas that were affected. As a result of the Crusades, we see increased trade. Even before the Crusades, Europeans had developed a taste for luxury goods that merchants brought from the Byzantine Empire. The Crusades increased the level of trade. Returning Crusaders brought back just exotic fabrics and spices and perfumes from the Middle East to a much larger market. Merchants in Venice and other northern Italian cities built large fleets to carry crusaders to the Holy Land, and they'll later use those fleets to open new markets in the Crusader states. And even after the Muslims had recaptured Acre, Italian merchants kept these trade routes open. Our words sugar, cotton, rice, and muslin, which were borrowed from the Arabic, show the range of trade goods involved. And really, the most popular trade good, or one of them, is spices, because all of a sudden, Europeans are being exposed to all these wonderful new flavors. Europeans who are used to only salt. And so this is going to be huge because this is going to lay the foundation for the age of exploration, because there's going to be such a huge market for these goods back in Europe that it puts pressure on the merchants to find the quickest way to the east. How can they get there as fast as possible, get the goods, get them back to Europe? And so that leads to the age of exploration. The Church. Enthusiasm for the Crusades brought papal power to its greatest height. Unfortunately, this period of enhanced prestige was short-lived. Popes were soon involved in bitter conflicts with feudal monarchs. Also, the Crusades did not end the split between the Roman and the Byzantine churches. In fact, as a result of the Fourth Crusade and also the broken oath in the First Crusade, Byzantine resentment against the West just hardened. Feudal rulers. The Crusades also helped to increase the power of feudal monarchs. Rulers won new rights to levy taxes in order to support the Crusades. Some rulers, like Richard, led the Crusades, which greatly added to their prestige. The money economy and serfdom. The Crusades further encouraged the growth of a money economy. To finance a journey to the Holy Land, nobles needed money. They allowed peasants to pay rents in money rather than grain or labor, and this, over time, helped to undermine serfdom. And finally, we see a wider worldview. Contacts with the Muslim world led Christians to realize that millions of people lived in regions they had never known existed, and soon a few curious Europeans even began to visit far-off places like India and China. One great example is Marco Polo. He was a young Venetian, and in 1271 he set out for China with his merchant father and uncle. He spent more than 20 years there, actually worked for the Kublai Khan, the ruler. And after 20 years, he returns to Venice, filled with stories about the many wonders of Chinese civilization. He wrote a book about his adventures, and unbelieving Europeans called him the Prince of Liars, totally rejecting what they saw as just incredible stories, tales of government mail service and of burning black stones, coal, that could heat entire rooms. But the experiences of crusaders and of subsequent travelers like Marco Polo expanded European horizons. They brought Europe into a wider world from which it had been cut off since the fall of Rome. And by the 1400s, a desire to trade directly with India and China would lead Europeans to a new age of exploration.